Hi everyone, welcome to the AOD Sector Workforce on Engagement, Learning and Wellbeing webinar. All participants joining the webinar today are in a listen and view only mode. After the presentation, there will be a question and answer session and you can submit a question at any time during the webinar. To do so, please type your questions into the Q&A box located at the bottom center of your Zoom screen. You may need to move your cursor or tap your touchscreen device to see it. This webinar is being recorded today and will be available for viewing on the NADA website in the coming days. I will now hand you over to the host, Sam Biondo.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome and much appreciated for your attendance here today. Before I begin, I'd like to pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land we're on, wherever we may be around the country, and also pay my respect to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank our dear friends at NADA and especially Tada de Jesus for organising today, and in the spirit of collaboration we've developed this project over a number of months now, so thanks for that. For your information, my name's Sam Biondo. I'm the Executive Officer at the Victorian Alcohol and Drug Association, and we've entered into a collaboration with NADA to commission unique research, unique Australian research from Curtin Uni, looking at two important under-researched areas in the AOD field. Today's session will be on the AOD Sector Workforce Engagement, Learning and Wellbeing area. And the issues covered in this research will be looking at how to understand work performance, the impact and its impact as a function of the total work experience, what drives AOD worker commitment and engagement, also that designing great jobs is not merely about compliance or risk, but the provision of agency, mastery and relational experiences of staff within organisations and their employment. Why empowering workers means to increase role clarity, responsibilities and genuine support, and how psychological safety drives wellbeing and professional growth. All of these are very important considerations in any workplace and can go to making an organisation and an individual's life function smoothly and well, or could lead to a range of deficits. So we all know about the Q&A session and how to ask questions. At this point, I'll introduce Ramon. Ramon Wenzel, who by now many may be familiar with. Ramon's been a senior lecturer at Curtin University in WA in the School of Management. He's affiliated with the Future of Work Institute, Curtin University, and recently has had some career changes, and I'll leave that to Ramon to talk about. He's also been the Chief Investigator of the Australian Not-for-Profit Workforce Study and Director of Learning for Purpose initiative. So we couldn't get a better person than Ramon to be doing this sort of work. And he's headed up our research, which we've been very grateful for and been very good to work with. So to give an overview of the findings, I'll just hand it over to you, Ramon, and I'll come back later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you also for taking away all my executive summary of the report, which you have done well, so my job's done. Obviously, I'm just kidding, but you alluded really to the key things which I'm delighted to talk about today. So my name is Ramon. I am adjunct fellow now with Curtin University, continuing some of the research such as the Australian Not-for-Profit Workforce Study. I have shifted a little bit to do research with the Minderoo Foundation, just trying to generate and cause more impact in the translation area of the social science work. I am delighted and want to just appreciate and acknowledge the work that we have all done together. That's NADA and VAADA. That's Rob and Sam believing into this piece of work and especially Jane and Sam, who have been instrumental in bringing this to life and operating in the background on those logistics. Without those, that wouldn't have been possible. I also want to thank, obviously, everyone who indeed participated in the research, which have been quite a few across New South Wales and Victoria, and that's often not so much recognized, but there is time that goes into it, and we actually want to make sure that is converted into meaningful ways and not ends up in a black hole or some 500-page report that no one ever really dares to touch. So thank you for your time, your contribution, your honesty, your sharing your views. And today I would love to talk about the AOD sector workforce and their experiences at work, which then have downstream effects onto the things you really care about, namely the impact we're going to have. But it's more about sort of this translation mechanism, which I will go into today, because sometimes that can seem a bit obtuse or obscure. And also want to clarify that it's not just stuff, that some people make up if they use a certain language, but there's a sort of a robust science behind it and robust analytics behind it, which I want to allude to today. So you got a bit more clarity on how we got there and how we can make these claims, and then hopefully convince all of you or most of you that it's worthwhile looking into these topics or subjects and going further. And I will make a few more comments on this as we go forward. So can I just get a quick response if my screen is shared and that's all visible to you? Sam?
It's all good to me.
It's all good. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. So, and thanks for those who entered it into the chat, which I'm not monitoring as I'm going through the next half an hour or so, but my colleagues at VAADA do. And so I will then enter Q&A mode in about 30 minutes. What I would like to take you through is basically the idea that we need to look into the work experiences of the workforce, but also the leaders and managers. And so I want to make, I'll give you just a brief heads up. This is basically part one of a webinar series, and also the first report of two reports which speak to that. There is a second report that will be made available shortly as well, and we have a second webinar on this. And the idea is that these are complementary pieces, and what's also useful to understand is that we've done the research in New South Wales and in Victoria, and we report on these findings for the most part in a combined way, but where it was useful to single a jurisdiction out, or so we have done that. And so as a result, we actually have basically two reports of each reporter, each side of the story, which you certainly do not need to read both from New South Wales and Victoria to be across it, but it's probably useful, especially for understanding a few distributions and means, and maybe some emblematic or rich quotes to rather orient yourself onto the one that better represents your home jurisdiction, if you will. What we are focusing on today is, as I said, the AOD sector workforce on engagement, learning and well-being, and this is what I'm presenting is on the combined findings, and that's what we're going to look at. So why we did this research, so we basically said the AOD sector can't bring about positive change without its people. It's very clear to some, but it's sometimes not that clear. Sometimes people believe that workers need to do the job. But in fact, how AOD workers experience their work determines very much how that work is enacted. And so the research then seeks to understand and illustrate how some of those elements of the AOD sector workforce affect the work environment and affect the workers themselves and how they can go about doing their work. And ultimately, this is designed to inform what could be done about it. I will acknowledge that there has been phenomenal research done by others in this space, especially on the AOD sector, but not exactly through that lens. So some of these topics we canvassed today, they have been on the periphery of some of the work that's been done. Sometimes it's been done in different ways, and I believe it's very useful to acknowledge this, which we do in the report. And there are a couple of references if you are new to this. Though I do believe that this lens that through which we look at this today probably hasn't been applied to the AOD world, and that's how we designed the research or how we got there. So how did we do it? We had a large comprehensive online survey that was live between roughly July and October 2021 last year. And that gathered about 664 valid responses across the two states. Not all respondents volunteered to indicate their jurisdiction, so the numbers don't add up to the same figure. If you look at those numbers here, let me just highlight something for you. So we got about 250 workers in New South Wales and a bit more in Victoria. That doesn't add up to the 600 something responses if you quicken math. But these are simply people who choose not to reveal their location, which obviously we respect in terms of privacy. The participation was largely enabled through a no-cost mechanism or no cost to the organizations, whereby AOD workforce, AOD sector organization could access a workforce analytics dashboard that sort of aggregated some of the responses from their own workforce onto their unit of analysis. And hopefully we were able to bring some of the topics onto the radar and into conversations. People were also able, obviously, to respond to those surveys individually, regardless whether their organization championed this idea or not. The survey is fairly comprehensive. It was captured about 250 single items. Sounds a lot, is not too much if you design it well. It still took about 27 minutes or 25 minutes on average to complete that. Typical Likert scale text responses. It's a broad gamut of measures which basically capture the experiences and psychological states and views of the workforce. And then we added rich qualitative data to it, which we then all packed together, analyzed using certain established organizational science theories, and they are depicted going forward. What you see here is a heuristic. This is not the perfect model. That's exactly how the world works, but it's pretty close though. So what you see is basically how things interact with each other. And there's very strong research to support this. There are meta-analytic studies which have aggregated about 200 other single studies with more than 60,000 total participants. And that they show that organizational leadership and HR systems and the design of work, they all have a very systematic effect on things you care about if you own this organization, or if you lead this organization, if you work in this organization, pardon me, or if you are a user or client of that organization in regards to the quality of service provided. So things such as staff retention and productivity and user retention or client retention, they're all outcomes of those mechanisms. And if you work that backwards from the right hand to the left side, you understand that it's a system of influences that basically modify the outcomes that you really care about. And we use this heuristic as an opportunity to evidence, to capture data, to evidence and illustrate these mechanisms, which are sometimes a little bit more hidden when you look into them. They become a bit more easy to grasp. And so that's what I would love to talk with you about. And so we go from retention, because without having workers or retaining workers, you can't do really a lot. But then we work that backwards from, what sort of driving performance, what's driving engagement, and especially with a focus on the design of work itself, what's driving learning and what's driving well-being. And then we just are bound, sort of restricted by the scope of the webinar, but it gives you a good idea, I believe. So what you're seeing here are a few things, and just remain with me for the next few minutes, and it hopefully will make a bit more sense. And I certainly do not intend to confuse anyone, but we want to be clear on what we have been doing. So here we are looking at retention as a concept, and basically what we ask is workers' intentions to voluntarily maintain their membership over the next 3 years within the organization they're in now. And that intention to stay has been shown that it is a decent reflector of what actually happens. It's not 100% correct, but it's a very solid reflector of what actually happens. And it's sort of a one item or one question reflection of a lot of things, but we want to break this down and want to understand what's driving this, what's sort of making people stay or leave. And why is that an important one? Well, it is important because in order to operate optimally as an organization and serve your clients at very high levels, you got to manage those sort of aspects. You got to reduce turnover, because otherwise you'll be faced with constant high recruiting costs. A lot of tacit knowledge is lost, relationships with clients are lost, efficient operations are disrupted because knowledge and certain routines just walk out of the door. And so you don't want that. If you really care about service delivery and service quality, you don't want that, right? And there's a bit of natural attrition, but certain organizations have more than others. And so what's driving this? You can see from this slide that we say there are three things that play a main role in this. One is organizational commitment, the other one is satisfaction with the job, and the next one is satisfaction with the organization. And I go into this in a minute, but I want to focus on this sort of chart here and explain this a bit to you so you feel you're comfortable looking at it. It's not complicated, but let me unpack this. And the report has those charts, and they can be quite telling. What we are doing is we are plotting the distribution of responses. So what is your intention to leave, for instance? Here on this example, just here it says motivation to lead, but it could be any concept or phenomenon. That's just for illustration, this chart here. What we look at is called a violin plot because it sort of looks a bit like a violin. And what it contains is also a box plot. So let's focus on this sort of these squares here for just a minute. What they basically do is they give you the median, meaning what is the most typical response to or value for a question that's been asked. And we have a scale that is going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the right-hand side. And so the most people would respond to that question as a 3 or just below, because if you compare that to the box plot here, there's a bit of a distinction, so that the female side, which is more the pink one side of the plot, would suggest that the female woman side is responding with a 3, and the male side on average it's about 2.8 or something like this. We indeed have those figures down here, which means you can read them up, and if they're distinct, that's pointed out. So what you also see is a distribution, because you can have an average or median, but you don't really know what the distribution is if you have a camp that sits at the bottom and a camp that sits at the top, or if you have everyone sort of congregating in the middle. These things can be quite meaningful, especially if you were to have two sort of camps, one that's very happy, let's say, and one is not happy, then that's maybe reason to investigate further. And it just basically allows you to see where most of the responses sit on a given metric. It's a good at-a-glance view. And so here, in terms of retention, you do see that male, female are fairly equal in terms of the intention to stay. There's a bit more wiggle room for the female side, saying some are perhaps a bit more inclined to stay on than males, but generally speaking, there's no real difference between these two groups if you were to split them into two groups, which was justified, as we point out in the report. Now back to what's driving this really. So as we see, the majority has a rather strong intention to stay on, which is, I think, a very good finding, but that doesn't mean everyone does. So what's driving this or what's causing the opposite? And it's that organizational commitment means how do people identify with a mission and the big idea of an organization. And so communicating that has a big influence on how people sort of think about their place in the organization. And satisfaction with the job is really the job they're having and the experience of that sort of role they're having. And satisfaction with the organization is their judgment about how this place in general works. Now, what are these numbers, though? These are regression coefficients, which I like to point out. They're expressed between 0 and 1. And so let me zoom into this. This is also in the report. The regression plot is one where you have all the individual, this is just another example here, all the little responses. So this was Mary, this was John, this was Paul, this was Peter, this is Sue, right? So they all gave one response, and we plot them on a scatter plot, and we have a sort of an x-axis and we have a y-axis. And we say, in this example, if the design of work is designed in a certain way, then the work performance may happen in another way. And people have different experiences, so these plots are just scattered around, but you can draw a line through it, and that's not me drawing a line, that's sort of a mathematical equation that emerges from those individual responses. And it allows you to understand a slope, and that slope is expressed between 0, which is there's no effect whatsoever, and there's 1 that would be a perfect effect, like it rains and everyone takes out an umbrella, would be a perfect 1, but that's rarely the case. Some people like to rain, some people don't have an umbrella, so you maybe have something like it rains and 0.7 is a likelihood that someone takes out an umbrella. So you have the same going on here. Now, if we look at basically the predictors of retention and look at job satisfaction, it means the more satisfied people are with a job, then the higher their intention to stay on is. Now, that may sound like nothing surprising that people are satisfied with their job, they stay on. But there are a few other things we looked at which maybe are surprising that don't have a systematic effect onto retention. So for instance, probably the one that sticks out the most, so let me grab that first, is satisfaction with salary. Does it mean everyone is satisfied with the salary? No, probably not. But it doesn't mean that it is a systematic driver for retention or attrition. Excuse me. What it does mean is that these other ones more systematically and larger basically explain what makes people stay. Now, individual circumstances may differ, and I'm not saying don't pay people well or anything like that. What it does mean is it's probably more useful to focus on these sort of other pieces than on some of those below. And satisfaction with benefits, that would be certain salary sacrifices or other perks that an organization might offer. And satisfaction with work conditions also does not have a systematic effect in terms of industrial relations. It might mean parental leave or so. Does it again mean these things don't matter? No, it doesn't. But there is a bigger lever in looking at those others. So if we then move on, and I'm not going to read through all of those, there are more sort of to highlight maybe one and then redirect you to the report which contains all of those quotes. We also, for each of the topics that we looked at, collected basically a non-prompted qualitative view of the situation, and we didn't ask people about their engagement or their well-being. We just asked them, what's good, what would you like to have stopped in your organization, what would you like to continue, and what would you like to start? And then we reviewed those and coded those and understood where they were, what they were relating to, and that's where they are, how they were affiliated in the report. And then we picked those that are most emblematic to the situation. And so in terms of retention, it's perhaps useful to see what people are saying. So the good thing is, right, allow me to work from home more regularly to complete admin tasks. So obviously it's a very prominent topic these days. What should my organization continue to be funding me with longer term contracts, right? That's something that somewhere happens, which is good, but please continue so. And that probably is raised on the back of the knowledge that's not always the case. And then there are other opportunities to be looked at, such as stopping fixed-term opportunities and being unclear about career development. That's not perceived as being helpful. So we talk about those in the report as well. And whilst we are not making any assumptions about representation to the wider workforce, these things might trigger a few more stimulating conversations than the figures alone. So it's the matching of the figures and the quotes. So let's move on to work performance with the end in mind, right? Work performance is a multifaceted phenomenon, and we didn't look at KPIs, or also on each organization is different, but work performance can be conceptualized as task proficiency, how someone fulfills the prescribed role requirements, and people have a pretty good idea typically about that. Also about their adaptivity, how they cope with and support change that's going on, because that's sort of a constant. And the last one is how proactive they are in initiating change and bringing about new ideas or protocols, even on a minuscule scale, in order to do their job well. And so that can be measured in pretty reliable ways. And working backwards then, what predicts that? And we understand, for instance, that people's confidence, people's self-efficacy plays a very large role in how people feel they can go about their job well. It's also their motivation or their engagement in work, which I talk about in a minute a bit more in detail. And it's about their skill proficiency, meaning do they feel they have the right skills? And so these are very systematic predictors of the performance on the job. And we want to highlight that these are all things we can address. So as an individual, in principle, I can address these myself if I'm highly self-directed and self-regulated. It's also that as an organization, I can bring about these experiences and states. I can make people more confident. I can create an environment that is more motivating and engaging, that makes people have more dedicated, vigorous, and absorbed experiences at work. And I can bring about opportunities to develop and learn, which may be a formal training intervention. It may be something entirely different, like mentoring, or just a good sort of climate to make mistakes in. And I talk about those in the next 15 minutes altogether a little more. And so what were some of the things that people have been saying in terms of what drives their performance or the opposite? Well, probably working in silos within the team is not a useful thing, so someone pointed that out, and that really alludes also to structural elements which we didn't look in, but probably something that organizations want to consider. Is that happening around here? And just jumping to the other extreme, this is the learning opportunity. So providing direct feedback on my work performance and offering opportunities to brainstorm and reflect on challenges and so on. So that's sort of a learning opportunity that I just alluded to. And we know for a fact that these things matter a lot in terms of how people feel they can go about their work, how confident they are. And confidence is not just something that we all should have. Also, there's a very cognitive strong mechanism, namely you assess your abilities to master any given situation by drawing on your sort of confidence heuristics, be that brushing your teeth, and by now you hopefully have done that for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and so you can do that. It's not a massive hurdle. But let's say for others it's learning to drive a car, and they're really scared about that situation, and so they stay away from it until they are being modeled how that really works, and have had some experiences, and these mastery experiences reinforce those cognitions. And the same goes for caring for others or having difficult conversations. If people don't have the confidence, they shy away from taking on these opportunities or shorten their involvement. And so that's what we mean by self-efficacy. It's a real strong cognitive effort, and you see this in athletes that have those slight distinctions, where it's not just exclusively about physical abilities or talent, but it is about the mindset, as is often referred to. Often that is what is referred to as self-efficacious cognitions, and they can be trained. They're malleable. So moving on, I want to talk about engagement, and especially the design of work itself. So engagement describes the positive state of mind and how much discretionary time and effort your workers are willing to give. Now, I know that engagement is a term that's used and abused all over the place, but basically how we measure this is how dedicated, vigorous, and absorbed your workers are. And there's other good research for the last 25 years that shows that that matters for work performance, client satisfaction, financial returns, and so on. The key driver to this is, amongst others, but here we have a few, the design of work itself, which is the content and organization of the work tasks and relationships and responsibilities. And so we looked at quite a few of those, and we can say that the mastery, agency, and relational aspects of the role and the design of work that people inherit, that matters a great deal, as are tolerable work sort of conditions in the job itself. And I want to focus on this a little bit more. So you can say that it's about balancing job demands and job resources. One has or is constantly exposed to job demands. You're being asked to do something, you're given something, and there's something coming up. And demands are also the basically time it takes, the energy it takes out of you, and the uncertainty that you need to deal with, and all these sort of things that you often can't control in a way. Resources are your time and your energy in a way, and these are very simplistic descriptions, but breaking it down makes it perhaps a bit more accessible. So providing someone with mastery resources would mean to clarify their role a lot more than maybe that's the case currently for some. So what's really my role? What's my remit versus what do I assume it to be? And that may differ greatly from the job description or how I was hired years ago, and things have changed, but I'm not really given feedback about this. So feedback here then is that information I need that what I'm doing is the right thing or the wrong thing, and helps me work out my own orientation and priorities and so on. That in effect leads to a higher task identity. So I better understand what needs to do and how I can contribute to that, and that basically brings out mastery experiences. So I'm more, again, confident that these things are the right things to do, and I'll be more directed towards doing those in the future again. Excuse me. And then we have agency, which describes distinct dimensions of autonomy. So how much scheduling autonomy or task autonomy or tool autonomy do we give workers when they do their work, how they do their work? I understand that, for instance, certain frontline jobs or highly regulated professions, that's not always possible to give someone 100% autonomy, but that's not what it is about. It is about to not prescribe you got 6.5 minutes, but maybe give that leeway to, you know, work out how much time you need for certain things yourself, but create a larger envelope to get certain things done. And we know for a fact that's not always happening. It also means relational aspects that provide resources. So that an individual experiences a sense of support, purpose, social context that help people feel it's not about not just being not alone, but actually that work is appreciated, that there is an interface for voicing concerns, that people feel that they get validated through their peers or their supervisor, and that they have abilities to communicate with someone in meaningful ways. And again, as a work environment, you can create these conditions or you can stifle them, and it's very important to address those. Finally, there is a tolerable sort of element in this, which is about time pressure and emotional demands and role conflict. So all of this amounts to how much energy and time workers have to complete their work, and the emotional demand they need to operate with or they need to cope with. And if that becomes too much and there is no, for instance, relational or sufficient relational element in their work, that they, I don't want to say vent, but maybe that's part of it, but to direct their feedback to, or get feedback and just review or debrief situation, then these sort of tolerable demands or intolerable demands become too much. And it will always be so that jobs have a physical and a cognitive dimension, and some of these demands are always demanding, right? We know this. Every job has those, but some can get too much. And to have opportunities that basically allow people to actively manage them is very important. And what we also have seen is that in a fraction of the workforce, job security or the job insecurity contributes a great deal to these psychological distress, which isn't helpful. So we can see that psychological distress has a negative effect on work engagement. And in fact, that's it doesn't show here directly, but it's driven by a large degree driven by job insecurity, which goes back to all these short-term contracts and not sure what the funding situation is next time. So bottom line here, it's about providing role clarity, feedback, autonomy, and social support, and actively managing areas of tensions and conflicts, and making job or work experiences more tolerable. I skipped that in the spirit of time. I want to focus a little on learning. And let me actually go back. So learning doesn't just sit in its own right, but it has a direct effect on performance. By means of, these are the actual knowledge and skills that people need, and thereby can bring about behaviors and principles. But you also have an effect on motivation or engagement. Namely, it's good that we know, but if we know things, it doesn't mean we always do them. And doing things differently, especially if they're new, requires motivation, especially if people need to try something that is new indeed, and they need the confidence that, you know, they can make a mistake. And that's okay. So then learning basically is a big envelope of different experiences, self-directed learning, knowledge sharing experiences with peers or from peers, participation in formal training, obviously, development plans, career development plans, reflection exercises, or just opportunities for individual reflection. being able to access experts or expert content if in doubt, or if really a high risk topic needs to be addressed, or decision or policy needs to be established. Giving and receiving feedback. We mentioned that a few times, but that is a learning opportunity, and maybe bringing about deliberate job challenges, or organically bringing about job challenges that make us, learn as we go along through the work. And so, again, this is bringing about this self-efficacy that I mentioned earlier. We have all these different work experiences that I just named, and it's bringing about self-efficacy for people, and it's bringing about skill proficiency. And these are exactly the things that I showed you earlier that map onto or drive performance. And so how do you bring about all these other learning opportunities? Well, there are two main sort of ways to think about it from an organizational perspective. One is really an organizational learning support climate, which means we live certain values and beliefs and have structures in place that all support learning and development in its different permutations. And people are encouraged to learn, and they're given resources, and there is recognition that's being signaled and received, signaled to people and received by people. And then there's an error management culture, and that's also very important. That's if we try things, we stuff up. And we all do it, and we're all human, and it's just part of how we operate, and that is okay, but it's not always accepted. Clearly, you should not make 10 times the same mistake in a row, but you should learn from errors. In order to do that, we need to share our mistakes, and we should be able to help each other in error situations and quickly detect and analyze what's gone wrong, how can we do this better next time, and do this as a collective. And that's not always lived in organizations, because people are perhaps fearful that those causes of the mistakes can derail their career, or it's an ego thing. And so leaders, management, and HR systems need to bring about a culture and model behaviors that support those things. And so basically, as a takeaway, if you have people reporting to you, then one of the things I want you to do this week is just basically stand up and say, when you made a mistake, and say, you know what, I've been to this webinar and Ramon said, when I stuff up, I shall say so. So I stuffed up. Here's what happened. Here's what I believe I can learn from this, and I want us to learn from this, or just help me make sense out of this. And do this as a collective. And then people are more engaged to do this with you going forward. And in fact, one thing that speaks to it is, what should my organization stop? It should stop ignore my recommendations and suggestions for feedback, and limit professional development hours. That's exactly sort of the opposite to what I said is driving learning. Finally, I want to talk about well-being. And in the spirit of time, couple takeouts. So psychological distress is something very closely related to burnout. It's not exactly the same, but it's about non-specific anxiety and depressive symptoms. And I'm sure I'm speaking to some people who know a lot more about this than me. But it brings about psychological states and emotional experiences which then impact workers' error rates. Like the more distressed we are, the more mistakes we make. We become less creative. All of this has stifling flow-on effects on motivation and performance, and then the client experiences. And then the other thing is work-to-family conflict, which is how work eats into our personal life. It's not just that we, are fatigued at some point, but that we don't make it to dinner, that we're completely severely stressed, that we are distracted at home, although we are not working. And this is not good. And we can see that some of the things I already mentioned today are driving these negative experiences, so the opposite of well-being. And that is, amongst some, it's time pressure, which goes back to the design of work itself, to incentive systems, and that needs to be addressed. To experiences of job insecurity and psychological safety, namely, the more psychological safety people have, the less psychologically distressed they feel. And so to just explain that differently, psychological safety is an experience people are having that means how can they show and employ themselves without fear of negative consequences? It goes back, in fact, to what I said earlier, saying I made a mistake, I stuffed up, and I feel it's not going to derail my career or my life. It also means I have a different opinion maybe than my supervisor, and I can voice that, or my peers, and I can voice that in a safe and respected way. I can share my ideas, I can engage in healthy debate, and all of this is contributing to obviously a learning environment, but also just having effects onto people's individual well-being. And then again, it's about work schedule or work autonomy, and especially scheduling autonomy. That's why I mentioned earlier. So when I do things, give me a broader sort of envelope to operate in has been shown to make lives better and outcomes better, because people are much more better to juggle things than a certain external prescription. So I would love to stop here. I had a few more comments. I can wrap this up maybe at the very end. So this is really all I wanted to share for today, to highlight that, to annotate some of the things that the report discusses. But I'd love to hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ramon. It's Sam that's back. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'm just wondering whether I read them out or you just work your way through possible response to the first one about the evidence and what it says about retention in AOD sector being better or worse than other sectors, and what some of the factors are that influence this.
Benchmarking can be useful, but can be also dangerous territory. From what we have seen, there is no reason to believe that the AOD sector is particularly better or worse than other charity spaces. Generally speaking, retention is or the experiences that drive retention is a function of organizational size, maturity, professionalism. So size is a proxy for obviously economies of scale and resources. If you have 300 or 3 people makes a difference, which means not everyone is suited to the same environment. And so hiring for that fit, and that some people are more willing to deal with uncertainty, but also have more, perceive more benefit out of, let's say, being in a smaller place with less resources, but being more creative, being more agile. Doing that is maybe more suitable for some is important. So it starts with hiring, in fact. And then just professionalizing your retention system. Do you have actually, I don't want to say a retention policy, that sounds too policing or too formal and just something too far away, but do you have a deliberate, active approach how you retain people, right, as an organization? Meaning, do we ask people what's wrong? Do you look at stuff that we look at here right now, generally speaking? And I think that if you have someone who owns this space, and who translates that and who understands what people really want, or do you have exit interviews as a protocol? And if so, do you actually capture what people say? And if so, do you systematically look at this to learn from it? So that's more the useful question to ask than to say, are we better or worse? I know I didn't answer the question maybe, but because it's really not better or worse than elsewhere, but it's what's driving it. It's important.
Thanks, Ramon. It shows true wisdom. The second question is about whether researchers assess the impact and attitude on the workforce of what seems like constant range of initiatives, program changes, and the impact of that on staff satisfaction, and what that might say about management and leadership in their application of change processes.
Right. So is a question about constantly changing priorities and projects? Is that sort of what this alluded to?
Yeah, and stability within the organisation, I think.
I think there is also something we briefly I didn't allude to actually today, which is called empowering leadership, it's called. So I deliberately did stay away from this today a bit, but we will revisit this next webinar. Empowering leadership has reflects the idea that leadership is not what one person is doing, the heroic leader that brings glory to everyone, but that leadership is a shared exercise. And there might be people who are more in power or have more autonomy or more knowledge, and some, that's fine. But it means it's a shared idea that we all live around a place to some extent. And it has very concrete elements such as coaching each other, sharing a lot of information. And there is, I think that speaks to this. Sharing information can be really, really powerful. Often that's not been done. So sharing information about what we're going to do, why we are doing it, why that's important to do now, as opposed to doing something else or doing nothing. And really addressing your workforce, your people, and assuming there is a certain amount of intelligence and motivation to understand things. And typically that's the case, unless it's been breathed out of them. And unfortunately, that's not done always, because people don't have time themselves or don't believe that's what's part of their role. But once people are provided useful information, they are actually coming along a lot more, even if you have constantly changing priorities. And that goes down, to become a bit more granular here, that goes down to how much money we have available, how is our cash flow situation, how dire is the situation. It can mean those things. It depends obviously on a lot of factors, but it's important, I believe, and it's not just my view, it's sort of supported by other research, that if change is constant and there are lots of external dependencies, then it's useful to be really transparent about this. And then people get the hang of it while you're doing certain things. And what's important is that you say, we do this together and here's the information, and you solicit feedback and you say what you take on and what you don't. And that itself is a very time-consuming and energy-draining exercise. But that arguably has much better downstream effects than just not doing any of it. That's one response.
So you're essentially saying it's sort of a democratization of the workplace with the participative ownership of the issues that help it function.
It can be that. It doesn't have to be fully democratic, and even a democracy, as we know, it doesn't mean we all have our say all the time. What it does mean is that there is, I think, more information, that value is given to information, and meaningful information is being shared, as opposed to information asymmetry, that only if you know and others don't, and they're at the end of a chain of commands or decisions that they don't understand. And so if today we're painting the walls green, and tomorrow or next week they're red, and the next day we tear them down, and no one knows really why, and they don't see what difference it makes to the clients or the bottom line of the organization or sustainability, then they become ignorant or cynical about it, and that's not good. Whereas sharing that information in accessible ways and being transparent about the thinking behind decisions can go a very long way. And it doesn't mean that everyone has a say in those decisions. So hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you, Ramon. Rachel Shanklin's got a question there about if you could explain the work-to-family conflict and the differences between male and female responses a little more.
Sure. Let me go back. Good question. So what we can see here is, I believe that's what the question is directed to, that the median of work-to-family conflict perceptions or experiences is a bit lower for the female side than for the male side. Good pickup, by the way. So I thought about this too. I don't have a very good answer, because we couldn't follow up on it directly and in a representative way. This is one explanation. Don't take it as gospel, but I believe there is an explanation to be found in other literature, which goes which reflects that women are more pain tolerant in a way. And that's actually true in physical sense, in the physiological sense, and that has obviously evolutionary benefits. But it's also about not whinging as much, if you know, for the lack of a better wording. And I'm not saying, by the way, anyone's whinging here, but it means that there's a more accepted role or reality when it comes to you know, family management, perhaps in a traditional sense, than it is perhaps for males, and then how work conflicts with that. Another explanation, however, could also be that, and that's a bit hard to do, the way we capture in terms of what data we capture, but how much work people actually do, their work rostering, and and there's a correlation between the female side and engaging in less hours of work, just a little, probably in order to care for families. So maybe the mechanism here is that they're just better to allocate certain responsibilities across, you know, the 24 hours of a day, as opposed to someone who realistically works maybe more towards 10 hours a day on the right-hand side. So there are a couple of complementary potential explanations. I can't say for sure, but hopefully that's a bit helpful in the way we need to think about it.
Thanks, Ramon. I think we're getting close to the end of the session. For those questions around a copy of the slides, I know that the recording will be made available when after the next session runs. So both part 1 and part 2 will be notified to the sector next week. We've got the next session on the 10th of March, and we'll also be making the report available, I know in Victoria, probably today or tomorrow. So many of these slides are contained in the report, and they'll be available in that. At this stage, unless I've forgotten something and someone wants to interrupt from my colleagues at NADA, I'll bring the proceedings to an end, and thank you kindly, Ramon, for your taking time out to do this. It's very much appreciated. I've seen the reports. It's very rich data, very rich, and it actually brings to the pointy end and opens up a conversation, and the richness lies in where the conversation needs to go about how we deal with this going forward. So I look forward to hearing part 2 on the 10th of March. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and thanks, Ramon.
Thank you.